1947, Bedouin shepherds found 3 scrolls hidden in a clay jar in a cave in the Judean desert. They were written in an ancient language on parchment made from goatskins. They took the scrolls to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem named Kando. Soon afterwards, more scrolls were discovered in the same cave. And slowly the scrolls came into the hands of scholars in Jerusalem. Professor Eleazar Sukenik of the Hebrew University was the first to recognize that they could be as much as 2,000 years old. But not till a year later, when the Holy Land was on the brink of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, did the existence of the scrolls come to worldwide attention through a short news item in the Times. They included an almost perfect scroll of the Old Testament book of Isaiah, a commentary on Habakkuk, and what looked like the rule book of a monastic community, which American scholars label the Manual of Discipline. Not until 1949 were scholars able to visit the site and begin an archaeological excavation. And in 1951, a first excavation was made at the nearby ruins of Qumran to see if these buildings had any connection with the scrolls. The excavators, led by the French archaeologist Roland Devaux, found evidence here which they believed established that link. There was pottery of the same type as they had found in the Scrolls Cave. In this room they found remains from an upstairs room which had collapsed into it. The inkwells and remains of what looked like writing desks suggested that it was a scriptorium or writing room where scrolls were copied. They named this large room the assembly room, a place where the community could meet and eat. The scrolls mention frequent ritual washings as part of the pattern of their religious life, and the buildings reveal meticulous methods for collecting and storing water. There were aqueducts channeling water from the hills. And here you see dramatic evidence of how winter rains would suddenly rush over the cliffs and could be channeled into strategically placed aqueducts. This 2,000-year-old aqueduct can still carry water today. In this way, water was channeled into storage cisterns and into the ritual baths used for their regular rites of cleansing. The crack down the middle of this ritual bath is the result of an earthquake in 31 BC. Devaux dated the various stages of the building from about 140 BC to AD 68, when the buildings were destroyed by the Romans during the Jewish War. Presumably the Qumran community hid their precious scrolls in the nearby cave as they fled before the advancing Roman forces. No sleeping accommodation was found on the site, so the people who used it must have slept in tents or in the caves in the cliffs above. Not surprisingly, both Bedouin and archaeologists now began to hunt for more caves containing scrolls, and by 1956 10 more such caves had been discovered, yielding up a wide range of scrolls, often in very fragmentary form. The main scrolls are identified by the number of the cave in which they were found, from 1 to 11, followed by the letter Q for Qumran, and then 1 or more letters which usually represent initials of the Hebrew name of the scroll. For example, 1QISA is the Isaiah scroll from Qumran Cave 1. 1QS, also from Cave 1, is the Manual of Discipline or Community Rule. 11QT is the Temple Scroll from Cave 11. On the basis of certain similarities between the archaeological evidence, the content of the scrolls themselves, and descriptions in the Roman writer Pliny and the Jewish historian Josephus, Professor Stuckenbuck and Father DeVoe believe that the people who lived at Qumran and wrote the scrolls belonged to the Jewish sect known as Essenes. I asked an expert on the scrolls to tell me more about what kind of a community lived at Qumran.
We're dealing with a community that first of all collected scrolls. We know that because there is evidence of jars corresponding to the kinds of clay and jars that we find in the caves which contain scrolls nearby. So we know they were collectors of scrolls and that they copied scrolls. And since the content of the scrolls is that of a very pious form of Judaism, amongst others, we can derive the religiosity of the community living there predominantly over 150 years as being a very pietistic, priestly inclined group of people. If faced with the choice between identifying with them with Essenes or not identifying them with Essenes, we err on siding with the Essene hypothesis. There are so many details in Josephus' description of the Essenes that correspond with specific details in some of the scrolls found nowhere else in Jewish sources from antiquity. Josephus attributes a number of features to the Essenes as a whole. He acknowledges that they live throughout the villages of Judea and what we would now call, and much later, Palestine. And he, for example, attributes to them a belief in hemarmene, which is the Greek word for fate. Now, they would not have used the word hemarmene, nor would they have called themselves Essenes. But the idea of fate can be found in the scrolls if we think of God's omnipotence, omniscience, the predeterminism of life that occurs in the community rule, for example, and the Damascus document. That's just one example of the distinctiveness. I think what really makes it possible to draw correspondences between Josephus's report on the Essenes and what we have, for example, in the community rule, are the graded entry for membership in the community. Again, such descriptions of entry we find nowhere else amongst our ancient Jewish sources, nor even in the rabbinic literature, which comes later on. So that again, I think, points to some relationship between the reports of Josephus and what we have in the scrolls. There are two ways of categorizing the documents. One is by language and another is by type. If we go by language, we have 23 Greek manuscripts which can be isolated as different Greek manuscripts. 19 of them come from Cave 7, which only contains Greek materials, and 4 relating to Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible come from Cave 4. 1/6 of the manuscripts, which we identify as such, are in Aramaic, and the rest are in Hebrew. The current count of the number of manuscripts found is 930. But from those, we have 20 to 30,000 fragments. Some even say 100,000 fragments, depending on how they are counted. Once fragments were pieced together in the 1950s, they would no longer be called individual fragments. Pieced together, they would be called a fragment. So the numeration of fragments will vary depending on whom you are talking with.